When someone who has been evil, not just in terms of behaviors, but in terms of their essence, in terms of their intentions, what do you do when they have targeted you and someone comes along and says, you know what? I think you just need to forgive and forget, just move on. We've been looking at that issue. We're going to continue to do a deep dive into what is forgiveness, what is it not. And as Jesus laid out in what's called the Sermon on the Mount, when are we blessed? When are we going to find that his favor is upon us? It's actually in two categories. And we will look at that next on this edition of Journey to Healing.
Welcome to Journey to Healing. Do you find yourself discouraged, troubled, in need of healing, but not sure where to turn? Jon Uhler, a licensed professional counselor, is here to help. Jon has more than 25 years of professional experience helping people deal with the issues that keep them emotionally and spiritually stuck. There is help. There is hope. There is a God who loves you and wants to help you find peace and strength. And Jon Uhler is here to help you find that on this edition of Journey to Healing.
Welcome back, everyone. My name is Jon Uhler. This is Journey to Healing. We're here every Friday night, 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we are looking at some of the most important topics that are involved in helping someone on to their journey to healing. We are doing a deep dive, not just into boundaries, but the issue of forgiveness. I recommend you go to survivorsupport.net under the podcast tab to bring yourself up to speed so that you have context to know what we're talking about, because we have really been setting forth the proposition, which I believe is the correct proposition when it comes to forgiveness. It really runs counter, unfortunately, to what has crept into churches and into modern psychology about the issue of forgiveness. There can't be much more of an important issue than forgiveness. It's second only to the issue of salvation. And by the way, salvation happens when we are forgiven. So they are very close parallels. And the question is, do you have to forgive everyone? Again, you're going to need some context to where we are picking up. So again, go to survivorsupport.net under the podcast tab and begin to listen to the very methodical approach to this concept that you will hear oftentimes people will tell someone that was deeply wounded by a very evil person, a wicked person. We've looked at what category that is. There's two categories of evil people. One would be persecutors. The other would be oppressors. When Jesus said, love your enemies, he used the word for those that would fit into oppression. Those are people that do things out of ignorance. They can do very hurtful things, but as Paul himself said, he was eligible for forgiveness because he did what he did out of ignorance. The Roman soldiers were eligible for forgiveness. When Jesus said, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. Who was he talking about? We looked at that in depth. He was looking straight down at the foot of the cross for those that were harming him, but it was truly nothing personal. But the scribes and Pharisees and high priests that were running their mouths, twisting in the knife at the cross, they were not forgiven. He said they were of their father, the devil. Judas certainly was not forgiven. So there's a meme that we have continued to look at, which basically says that I never knew how strong I was until I had to forgive someone who wasn't sorry and accept an apology I never received. That is horrible, okay, in terms of mind games. God doesn't play mind games, right? If you listen to that, it sounds wonderful. It sounds very poetic, but it is so off base. Why? Because God doesn't forgive without the hurtful person, without the injurious person, without the person that has been perpetrating. without them confessing. And we've looked at that in depth. Where we ended last time was really setting the stage for what the listeners of Jesus's first sermon, really the largest public sermon, so we could say second recorded sermon. The first was in the synagogue of his hometown. He went back there, and it's interesting. He said he was given the scroll, talk about timing, and he picked up where they had left off. He's visiting, and he finds the messianic psalm, and he then was going to exposit it. And he said that the most important of all messianic psalms, and I mean, it's very clear, it was speaking of him. And in that psalm, it references some very telling things. And the listeners, the hearers would, and we have to put ourselves into the minds, into the bodies, as it were, of the hearers. Sometimes it's very tempting to spiritualize verses that don't need to be. There are a lot of verses that have both a literal and a spiritual meaning to it, but it's always best when exegeting a passage, when bringing out from the passage what it means, it's always best to stay with the literal first. Because when Jesus was talking, or when Isaiah, which is who Jesus was quoting, 700 years before Jesus stepped into that synagogue in Nazareth, Isaiah was speaking to people of his day, and he was using regular language. And they would know when he would use certain words what that would mean. So, for instance, when he would use, and we looked at this over the past number of weeks, as far as what categories of people are very near and dear to God's heart. Who has God's heart? Meaning, who will God protect? And we looked at that, first of all, with the idea of if you are on the receiving end of persecution, God will be with you, but especially if you are under oppression. So we looked at those two categories. And then we looked at the concept that if someone is hurtful, if they become increasingly hurtful, if you look at the bottom left of this chart, you will see a little guy with a knapsack. He has crossed a fence. He's crossed a boundary, and in a moment, he's going to drop his knapsack in this picture, and he will move from left to right. That increasingly thick arrow is the degree of selfishness. And as someone becomes selfish, what happens? They negatively impact someone. The sighs, the cries, and the prayers of the victims, because eventually that injury is going to become worse and worse, the negative impact, and that rises to the heavens, and God collects that pain in a bottle, Psalm 56:8, and then God's protective heart, look right to the right, that's a little heart there, next to that middle thermometer, and God takes up the cause of the injured. And why does he do that? Because it is a tremendous gift. He says to those on the receiving end of evil, whether persecution, but especially oppression. To really understand this, we shift into the category of oppression. And those are people that as a matter of fact, we looked at that before. There's three categories noted in the book of Proverbs. We have the simple, the mocker, and the fool. The fool is the modern day rendering of white collar psychopath, according to the Uhler theory, but it is true. Okay, that means the person has gotten off of the straight and narrow, down on the bottom left, and has moved into the target zone. Why? Because he's becoming increasingly hurtful, and God takes note. And so that's where this picture comes in. And so God's greatest gift to someone who is being injured is not only to let them know he's there to support them, but he says, vengeance is mine. Why? Because if we take matters into our own hands, what might happen? We might go to jail. So what a tremendous gift that God gives those that are significantly and meaningfully negatively impacted, that he gives them the gift that he himself will take up their cause. He says, vengeance is his. That's a beautiful thing. That was the last words. Those were the last words in Deuteronomy 32 that God promised the Jews through Moses. So Moses' last words to the new generation that were actually going to go into the land that God had promised, the promised land. God was reiterating a second time his law. And he closes, God does through Moses, with a promise, the promise to avenge their injury if perpetrators harmed them. The Jews understood that was God's promise. So when you see, so I'm here to tell you, when you see the word promise singular in the book of Psalms, I contend that David and others are referencing that promise. Because there are a number of different kinds of promises. God makes a number of different kinds of promises. But when David, in the midst of being on the receiving end of significant hurt, when he says, Lord, I hold on to your promise, well, which one's he talking about? He is talking about what God himself said he would do when somebody was harming his people. So David was holding on to that. The good news that God would bring his people was the good news of his faithfulness. And whenever you see in the book of Psalms the term his faithfulness and loving kindness, you're going to find that almost exclusively those fall into imprecatory prayers or fall within an imprecatory prayer. What's an imprecatory prayer? We've looked at that in the past. That is simply a prayer that says, God, you know what they're doing. Get them on my behalf. Why? Because God made a promise. That is his loving kindness. He will actually show us that he will intervene on our behalf. That's what so much of the book of Psalms is all about. It is God exercising that promise or exercising his protectiveness on our behalf. So the Jews knew that God was a protective God, and God then revealed something about himself. Because when someone is going through significant pain, and this is really a recap to bring us up to when Jesus stepped onto the scene, a lot of people were being oppressed. Israel was being oppressed by the Romans. Israel was being humiliated. We looked at different categories of oppression. Humiliation is a category of oppression. The Jews were being oppressed by the religious leaders. They were being taken advantage of. They were being exploited. They weren't being helped. We've talked in the past what are the different ways you can oppress someone? You place something on someone that they don't deserve. How about condemnation? How about criticism? We looked at a lot of that. How many times can somebody oppress someone verbally? A lot. We talked about slander. Or you withhold from someone what they do deserve. And God has indicated that to those that are poor, and so we camped on that category for a while, the word poor to the listeners of that day, to the people of that day, would reflect somebody that was not poor because of poor financial management, but because of oppression. That they had been driven from their home, they had been exploited, they had been taken advantage of to the point that they probably have lost their home. What does that make them? And especially if they were being driven out of the area, right? Because an evil person, a pig, a dog, a fool, but even more than that, a reprobate, white-collar psychopath, we've talked about that in the past. As a matter of fact, let me bring up a chart that we use all the time, which is this. So somebody in the pig zone, right, is more than just selfish. This is somebody who is progressively becoming an oppressor. And that's really, I should call it the oppression zone. Okay, so what will that person do? They will begin to target someone. They'll begin to target those they can exploit. And then they will target those that will intervene on behalf of those being exploited. Oftentimes, though, our timing is not God's timing. And the question is, where is God when evil is happening? The good news is it's twofold. One, God is not indifferent. Near the end of the book of Isaiah, God talks about how he was moved with compassion. He felt the pain of his people that were on the receiving end of injustice, even though in that case, they brought it on themselves, meaning they brought pain on themselves, but the Babylonians then doubled down on it. But he still felt what his people were going through. God is not detached. We have to risk believing that even when nothing is happening, something is happening. But as you read the book of Psalms, many of David's Psalms will start with, in essence, Lord, where are you? Do you see? Do you know? And that is the silence. It is the dark night of the soul. It is the valley of the shadow of death. That is when Satan will come along with doubt and discouragement and begin to ask, hey, what's up with this? If you are God's child, then why are you going through this? And the last thing we need are supposed friends. They weren't friends. When we think of Job's friends, those were not friends. Okay, those are friends in quotes. They actually came, by the way, to kind of rub it in because I believe they were jealous of Job. And now Job's everything in his life was turned upside down, and not just turned upside down, but destroyed, and he lost all his kids. It was a horrific situation. It was a satanic onslaught. And so here are these three guys that claim to be friends, but they weren't. So they wanted to kind of see the damage. It would be like somebody wanting to go and see a burned down house of someone who had worked hard and earned, was able to save, and then was able to build a nice home for himself, but was not hanging on to that. But he was, let's say, upper middle class. And then all of a sudden, tragedy strikes, and then you have people that kind of take a sadistic sense of satisfaction. That's what was going on for Job. It is during the time of waiting, it is during the silence that the most understandable thing that starts to happen is we wonder, does God care? And what does God say in that type of situation? What he said is this. In Isaiah 61, the Messiah would say, the Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me, for the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. What's the good news? Right? What is the good news? That he is not forgotten. Right? The enemy is coming in like a flood. The enemy is oppressing. The enemy is harming. So what does somebody need at that moment? What's good news? He has sent me to comfort the brokenhearted. Why are they brokenhearted? Because of oppression has destroyed them in their life. And to proclaim that captives, right, that's what oppressors do. They create captives. The captives will be released and prisoners will be freed. If you remember what it says in the book of Proverbs, I will find it here. Right? What is someone supposed to do when it comes to those that are falsely accused? I can't find I'll tell you what. We are commanded by God to intervene, to actively intervene. And so if someone has been wrongly imprisoned, we are to help free them. Okay, verse 2. He has sent me to tell those who mourn. Now think about the Sermon on the Mount, because that's where we're going with this, because it had been 400 years of silence. And Jesus starts his first sermon, what's called the Sermon on the Mount, went up on top of a mountain. Easy for me to say. He went up on top of a mountain. And think about the order in which he says it. Blessed are the poor. So you see, bring good news to the poor. Now we're going to go to verse 2. He has sent me to tell those who mourn that the time of the Lord's favor has come, and with it, here it is, the day of God's what? Anger against their enemies. God takes note. To all who mourn in Israel, he will give a crown of beauty for ashes. Why are they in ashes? Because of oppression has destroyed them. A joyous blessing instead of mourning. If your life has been destroyed, you are in mourning. And then what do you feel if you're in mourning? You feel despair. but God will bring festive praise instead of despair. And in their righteousness, meaning he will take up their cause, they will be like great oaks that the Lord has planted for his own glory. There's nothing as satisfying as when the Lord proves you right, when you are in the right. That is something that has staying power. That's the hope, right? That was the hope of Israel. Now, spiritually, of course, we understand that, but think about how the hearers would hear when Jesus began to speak. That's a little bit small, but this is Matthew chapter 5. Get close. It says, God blesses those. So Jesus is starting his public ministry with this sermon. Or really, he started his ministry already, but now this is going to be his first sermon. So God blesses those who are poor and realize their need of him. But it's actually, that was sort of bad. It said, blessed are the poor. Okay, for the kingdom of God is theirs. God blesses those who mourn, for they will be comforted. God blesses those who are humble, for they will inherit the whole earth. God blesses those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. Now, my contention is this. He is speaking to separate populations. He's now going to speak to those who are righteous. What do righteous people do? Well, righteous people, first of all, are growing. What is someone who is growing in spiritual maturity, who is becoming righteous? What does someone look like in terms of the stages of growth? We've looked at this chart before, but I want to show this to you again. They start with personal conversion, then they're getting their priorities and attitudes right. Then they start to work on their ethics, and then personal involvement and investment. In what? God is going to start to create a desire within them, an openness, and then a desire to begin to get involved in the lives of other people. Then there's going to be activism. You really won't be able to help but become active in the lives of other people. But it's not just active in terms of helping them become better people, but look at the highest stage, personal intervention and influence. When do you need to intervene in somebody's life? When someone is on the receiving end of injustice. In Isaiah 59 and 63, God said this, that he was appalled that there was no one to help, defend, or take up the cause of the oppressed. So he did it himself. What is he looking for? What is God looking for when it comes to oppression? He's looking for people to be his hands and his feet. In the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew 5, he first brings good news to those that are crying out in their heart of hearts, God, where are you? Do you see? Do you care? Do you know? He then is going to address those that have taken up that call to help them. He says, God blesses those who are merciful, for they will be shown mercy. He blesses those who are pure, for they will see God. He blesses those who work for peace, for they will be called the children of God. And God blesses those who are persecuted for doing what is right, for the kingdom of God is theirs. And then he's going to talk about being persecuted. I'm going to highlight now those different words. We've looked at the poor. That category is those that have become destitute because of oppression. They will then mourn. They will then also be very humble or meek because they don't want to take matters into their own hands. They're giving God room. Psalm 37 is one of those imprecatory prayers. That is how somebody is staying humble and meek while they are crying out. They're hungering and thirsting for justice. Who does God want to answer their prayer? He wants us to be a part of that. And so he's looking for those of us who will be merciful, whose hearts are pure, who work for peace. And what will be the result of that? We will be persecuted. Jesus, when he started his public ministry, started by talking to the two groups that are closest to his heart, the two populations, those that were on the receiving end of injustice that began to think that God had forgotten. So the Messiah steps onto the scene, and what does he say again? The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. This is what he read in Nazareth. But again, he then will go publicly and go in order, right? He talks about blessed are the poor. So he's bringing the good news to the poor. What is the good news? Of course, it is salvation. We understand that. But this would be the only time that, if we spiritualize the term poor, we're missing, I believe, what Jesus is saying to the listener, which is, if you think God has forgotten about the injustice you've been on the receiving end of that has significantly and meaningfully negatively impacted the course of your life, he hasn't. That's the good news. So we start with the literal rendering of that first. So I'm convinced that the listeners would have been amazed that, oh, God hasn't forgotten. Jesus was saying that God has not forgotten their pain, those that were being targeted by oppressors. In the crowd, there were those that were doing it right. There were those like John the Baptist. At that time, he had been locked up. But what was he doing? He was standing up for righteousness. And what happened? Off to prison he goes. And what was he wondering? Had God forgotten? So the cry of the human heart, the cry of the heart that is on the receiving end of pain is, Lord, do you see? Do you care? Do you know? And God wants those that are on the receiving end of injustice, he wants them to know that he has not forgotten. And those that have been doing the right thing by standing up for those that are oppressed, that are now being targeted by those who are targeting and exploiting the easy targets, right? Now you are being protective, then the oppressor will turn their sights on you. If you blow the whistle on evil people, what's going to happen? We're seeing what's happening in the news, where you have false allegations. They'll start to slander you. They'll start to go after you. They're going to destroy your life. That's what oppressors do. In Isaiah 41:17, God says, when the poor and needy search for water and there is none, and their tongues are parched for thirst, then I, the Lord, will answer them. I, the God of Israel, will never abandon them. Isaiah 42:3. He will not crush the weakest of reed or put out a flickering candle, but he will bring justice. Who is he? The same one that said that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to bring good news. The good news of what? That in Isaiah 42:3, he will bring justice to all who have been wronged. So again, those that are poor, those that have been oppressed, and it's not just financial poor, it is the result of injustice. God wants them to take heart. So the poor, which would cause someone to be needy, and when they're needy, they're mourning. Their life has been destroyed by these people. That's why they're weeping and they are crying out. They're hungering and thirsting for justice. The Messiah said that God has not forgotten. That is going to help sustain them. But for those that were willing to do the right thing and stepping up, Jesus has very important words. So the two categories of those that will be on the receiving end of oppressors, of evil, will be those that are minding their own business and doing the right thing. And suddenly they are being exploited. This could be the wife who the man she thought she could trust begins to target her, begins to make her life hell. It could be the husband who thought he was marrying a decent person but ends up with a Mother Gothel. This is the employee that's doing the right thing, and another employee starts to target him. Heard just recently about a guy that's dressing in drag, calls himself a trans. There's no such thing, by the way. And he is targeting this woman, quite frankly, for sexual abuse, for sexual harassment, whenever she goes to the restroom, this guy's targeting her. He's going in there too, knowing she can't say anything because it is a woke business environment. That is oppression. This is somebody who's very evil, right? Who's enjoying, he's quite frankly, he's a perpetrator. That may be an extreme example, but it's happening a lot. How about when a guy now dresses in drag and goes on a woman's sports team? The reason he's doing that is to access the locker room, by the way. But he's denying women of their hard-earned ribbons and medals. What kind of person is that? That is what the Bible calls an oppressor. He is perpetrating evil. What do you do when you are on the receiving end of that? You trust that the Lord has not forgotten, that He will take up your cause, He will empower you, and He will call others to come alongside you and to step up. You can trust that. If you risk believing that God has not forgotten, He will either take up your cause if there is no one left, or He will direct someone to help you. And we're going to look at then what happens when that person answers the call. That person becomes that protective wall and suddenly becomes targeted by the oppressor. What hope is there? Because all the guns will suddenly be turned on that right and just person. We will look at that next on the other side of the break.
Are you or someone you know a survivor of abuse and wondering where to turn for trustworthy help and insight into the effects of such abuse? Ever wish you had access to a resource that could help you continue your progress in healing? SurvivorSupport.net is that resource. Developed by Jon Uhler, a seasoned therapist with years of experience working with sexual abuse survivors, SurvivorSupport.net is a one-of-a-kind resource to help you understand the impact of abuse and to help you understand the nature of those who harmed you in order to help you gain clarity and continue healing. If you are interested in speaking with Jon Uhler about your situation or in having Jon conduct a consultation or a training for your church or organization, SurvivorSupport.net serves as a convenient method of contacting him. Our program, Journey to Healing, is made possible through the generous donations of viewers like you. There are many opportunities and needs that Survivor Support is attempting to meet, and your monthly support or one-time gift would be extremely helpful as we seek to meet those needs and opportunities. Simply visit SurvivorSupport.net and you will see the link to donate on the homepage. We thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. My name is Jon Uhler. This is Journey to Healing. We're here every Friday night from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on TECN.TV, the leader in Internet TV. We're picking up where we left off. We're looking at the two categories of people who have God's heart in a very special way. We've looked at who gets targeted, right? We've looked at that for the past number of weeks, and the people that get targeted are those that are perpetrating the harm. So those would be the people that our little guy there, bottom left, hops the fence because of selfishness. That means he's crossing boundaries and he is moving into the target zone. What target zone? God's targeted heart on behalf of those that are being harmed. The categories out of the book of Proverbs, we have subcategories. When somebody moves from the simple into the mocker and eventually the fool is an old-fashioned term. It's a biblical term. It's 3,000 years old. I contend it is the same term now as the modern psychology term, white-collar psychopath. That person is beyond hope, right? The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Once you say that, you've lost all fear. You do not believe you're ever going to be held accountable. Therefore, you have no remorse, you have no empathy, and you think it's stupid to ever want to be any other way than what you are, and you're going to double down on it. And that's why Proverbs chapter 1 through the end of the chapter talks about how they love what is evil and they hate what is good. That's what happens with a psychopath. they end up with a visceral disdain for anything good. And that's why they will be driven to destroy things, because they have harmonized with a very dark spirit. We looked at what happens when those psychopaths target people. That is not persecution, that is oppression. And an oppressor will go after somebody and destroy them and will ruin their lives, and therefore the people that are significantly and negatively impacted, those fall into the category of the poor, because they will destroy you, they will bankrupt you, they will exploit you, first of all, and they will take you for all you're worth. Jesus, when he gave his first sermon, he started to speak to those individuals first that were on the receiving end of oppressors. That is different than persecution. Persecutors, we've looked at that in the past. I recommend go to survivorsupport.net under the podcast tab and review all the programs in this series to understand the difference. God then has called people. He calls godly people to defend the rights of the poor. Well, if they were poor because of financial mismanagement, they don't have any rights. But the rights that they have are not because of financial mismanagement. It's because their rights are being overrun by evil individuals. And so God expects us to step up on behalf of those that are being harmed. We looked at in Psalm 107 the categories that can bring harm into somebody's life, but it starts with, well, let's see the first category. Verse 1, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His faithful love endures forever. I recommend, again, whenever you see the word faithful love, his faithfulness and loving kindness, that has to do with his protective nature that will strike out against injustice on behalf of those being harmed. Those are imprecatory prayers. He has the Lord redeemed you? Then speak out. Tell others that he has redeemed you from all your enemies. Those are oppressors. For he has gathered the exiles. How do you become an exile? You become an exile because you've been driven from your home. From what? Or why? Because of an oppressor. Verse 4, some wandered in the wilderness. Remember in Psalm 56:8, which we have in that chart? Well, let me bring that chart up again. We'll see the little bottle there. The word tears, he saves, he collects our tears in a bottle. That word for tears is also wanderings. When does somebody cry? When they're poor, when they have been so destroyed that they don't know what is next. So verse 4, some wandered in the wilderness, lost and homeless. That's because of oppression. And what happens when they are poor? They are hungry and thirsty. This is not a metaphorical thing. They hunger and thirst, but they also hunger and thirst after justice. Lord, help, they cry in their trouble, and he rescued them from their distress. This is not self-imposed distress. He led them straight to safety, to a city where they could live. They had been driven from their home. Let them praise the Lord for his great love and for the wonderful things he's done. For he satisfies the what? The thirsty and fills the hungry. When Jesus said, blessed are the hunger, blessed are those that hunger, they will be satisfied. The ears of the listener would be drawn to Psalm 107. Psalm 107, as a matter of fact, continues. Let me see if I can find it. There we go. It ends with, when they decrease in number and become impoverished, it's picking back up the issue of oppression. There it is. Through oppression, trouble, and sorrow, there's actually three reasons why someone would be homeless. Experiencing pain. So sorrow is the result. If we look at verse 39, I'll take those in reverse order. Sorrow is because of grief. Trouble is because we live in a fallen world. Oppression is because of evil individuals. So I can become impoverished through one of those three ways. Trouble, sometimes life takes a downturn. Impoverished, how about a widow who is in sorrow, but she has no means of providing for herself, or an orphan. But oppression can create poverty. The Lord pours contempt on their princes. That term is synonymous with those that are lording it over someone, and the rich and the powerful that are going to exploit and take advantage of people and cause them to become poor. So the Lord pours contempt on, we'll call that the oppressors, causing them to wander in trackless wastelands. There's Psalm 56:8. But he rescues, there it is, the poor and the needy. Those two words are the same. And what's he going to rescue them from? From trouble and affliction. So he wants those on the receiving end of harm to know that he sees, he knows, and he cares. Is it okay when somebody is going through something significant, whether on the receiving end of oppression or when they've stepped up, and the oppressor turns their sights on the protected person? Do we just forgive, as we're being told, forgive and forget? Blessed are the peacemakers, so don't worry about it, don't make an issue of it. No. Jeremiah, one of the major prophets, not in terms of he was, not 8 feet tall. He wrote a lot. There are a couple of books that are called within the major prophets because of the size of those prophetic books. Jeremiah, who kept praying for his enemies to a point that God said, don't do it, Jeremiah. You're praying outside of my will. Stop praying that I have mercy on them. I've given them over, meaning they crossed the point of no return. 5 or 6 times, God tells Jeremiah, stop. You're not praying properly. That's very interesting. So we need to make sure that our prayers are in alignment with God's will. When we say in Jesus' name, that means we're praying exactly how Jesus would. So Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. God's heart doesn't change. There are times when God says, don't pray for that person. We need to understand those categories because it is not spiritual to think I'm more sympathetic than God is. That's a very dangerous proposition, because none of us are more compassionate than God is. But if I have compassion on those God does not have compassion on, now who would that be? Let's go back up to, how about this chart? If you have compassion on a fool, how does God feel about that? Look up at the top. God does not want you to have compassion on a fool. You are disobedient. You are misguided if you have compassion on a fool, because God doesn't. And all you will do is give the fool an idea that it's no big deal. He won't care anyways. But what you will do is you will enable and rescue. You will have misplaced sympathies. God doesn't want you. He doesn't want you dealing with a pig, a dog, or a fool. And a pig and a dog isn't as bad as a fool. Right? If you look at the chart that we look at oftentimes, okay, a pig and a dog is at the starting at the -4. The fool is even worse. So if you have sympathy, if you take in those that Jesus told you not to in Matthew chapter 7, verse 6, you are not spiritual. What are you? You are disobedient. This is not spiritual. And you are bringing pain on yourself. As a matter of fact, you're not, because what's that person going to feel like? That person's going to feel like, because they're going to be taken advantage of, that's what Jesus said, and they're going to walk around feeling all that stress, and they're going to think, well, that's what spirituality does. That's the cross I have to carry. That is not the cross you have to carry, because God doesn't want that. So you aren't even in a position to be exploited or to be oppressed when you got pigs and dogs, right? You will find out what oppression is when you draw lines, boundaries with people. And if they start to target you, now you're being oppressed. So if you have invited pigs and dogs into your life, you're not even being addressed in the Sermon on the Mount. It's true. Okay, so continuing. Sorry. When you step up to protect someone that is being on the receiving end of hurtfulness, like Jeremiah did. So once Jeremiah figured out he wasn't supposed to pray, but he had a hard time realizing that there are certain categories of people he shouldn't pray for. But once he found out why God said, do not pray for these people, and he found out they were actually going after him, What did he say? In Jeremiah chapter 12, he said, "O Lord, you always give me justice when I bring my case before you." Now, I thought it was wrong to ask for justice, not with Jeremiah. So let me bring this complaint. And that's a good kind of complaint. Why are the wicked so prosperous? Why are evil people so happy? You've planted them. Now he goes on down to verse 4. People and the land can mourn. It's interesting. That was very symbolic because the people of Jerusalem knew that God wanted to raise up Jerusalem as an example of what happens when God's blessing is on them, on a people group. And so when they would mourn over Jerusalem, they were mourning over the fact that God's name, his reputation, was being slandered and disparaged. When we step up, when we protect, as Jesus turns to that second category, he's talking about those that are coming after people. And in Psalm 5, David is addressing this. He says, "My enemies cannot speak a truthful word." That's one of the keys, by the way, right there. They lie, they slander, right? Their deepest desire is to destroy others. Their talk is foul, like the stench of an open grave. Their tongues are filled with flattery. O God, declare them guilty. Let them be caught in their own traps, driven away. Now, notice the driven away, right? There's that wandering concept. Driven away because of their many sins, for they have rebelled against you. Go to the bottom there, verse 12. But God blesses the godly. Now, what does that remind us of when it says that God blesses the pure? When we are pure, we are most like God, when we have integrity. Psalm 112, starting at verse 4. So think about when Jesus was talking on the Sermon on the Mount. He's given hope to those that were on the receiving end of hurtfulness. But then he says what? Blessed are the merciful. By the way, that's compassionate and full of mercy. People are going to then, if you are compassionate, full of mercy, you're going to act on God's behalf. Psalm 103, verse 8. God says that, or David says that the Lord is compassionate and merciful, slow to get angry, and full of love. David was actually quoting God himself when God quoted his characteristics or described his characteristics to Moses, that he said he's compassionate and full of mercy. So when Jesus then turns to that second group that are going to step up and be protective, he says, "Blessed are the merciful." Mercy is active, it's not passive. Then he says, "Blessed are the pure." So that means I'm going to begin to get involved. What does it mean when it says, "Blessed are the pure," or whose hearts are pure? That word in the Greek means clean, unstained, guiltless, innocent, upright, spiritually clean, and godly. Well, what would the Jews, so Jesus said, "Blessed are the pure." They're going to think in terms of godliness. Those are synonymous. Psalm 112. Light shines in the darkness. Why would it be dark, by the way? Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, the deepest of valleys. That's physical death, yes, but that is also when I am under oppression, when my life is being targeted. It gets very dark. I see no hope. So light shines in the darkness for the godly or the upright. Those are the same terms. They are generous and gracious. They are what? Compassionate. God blesses who? The merciful. So compassionate and merciful, and the righteous and just. All those categories are packed into that one verse. Good comes to those who, there you go. Think about blessed are the poor. And so God says good comes to those who do what? Who lend money generously. So if somebody's poor, they need our help. Such people will not be overcome by evil. What do you mean? By evil people, the oppressors. Because if I'm now going to help those that the oppressors are targeting, the oppressors are going to target me. Those who are righteous will long be remembered. They don't fear bad news. They confidently trust that the Lord will care for them. Why? Because the oppressor is going to turn their sights on them. They are confident and fearless. They can face who? There you go, the oppressors, triumphantly. They share freely and give generously to those in need. That would be the poor. Their good deeds will be remembered by God forever, and they will have influence and honor. But here it is, the wicked, right? The oppressors will see what? Will see that God is honoring those that are stepping in, and they will be, yes, they'll be infuriated. They will grind their teeth, the perps will, they'll grind their teeth in anger, and they will slink away like little snails, little snakes, and their hopes. What hopes? The hopes of the evil will be thwarted. That's one of the promises God gives to those that are stepping up on behalf of those being harmed. So he wants those that are being protective to know that he hasn't forgotten. He will continue to uphold their righteousness. Godliness always involves action. Isaiah 58, 6-10 says this. When God says, listen, I don't want any kind of passive fasting. This is the kind of fasting I want. Okay, so if we're godly, this is what we're going to do. Free those who are wrongly imprisoned, lighten the burden of those who work for you, let the oppressed go free. There's that term oppression. Remove the chains that bind people. There's the imprisonment. Share your food with the hungry, the poor, and give shelter to the homeless. Why are they homeless? Because of oppression. Give clothes, or it could be certain circumstances beyond their control. Give clothes to those who need them. Again, this is literal. This is not figurative. Of course, salvation comes to the humble, but this is very literal. And do not hide from relatives who need your help. But those are decent relatives, not the pigs and the dogs, right? Then your salvation will come quickly like dawn, and your wounds will quickly heal. Your godliness, there it is. God blesses the pure, the godly. Your godliness will lead you forward, and the glory of the Lord will protect you from behind. Why? Who's coming after you? Right? The oppressors. Verse 10, feed the hungry and help those in trouble. There's that theme again, that they are on the receiving end of oppression. In Proverbs 24, verses 11 to 12, God says, rescue those who are unjustly sentenced to die. Save them as they're staggering to their death. Don't excuse yourself by saying, look, we didn't know it, for God understands the heart. Meaning something's going on, and it really is oppression that is happening. So when God energizes someone to do the right thing, they will start to intervene. Now, blessed are the peacemakers. What does that mean? It sounds like, and I've heard, you probably have heard, well, it just means, you know what, everybody needs to shake hands and, let bygones be bygones. That's not what a peacemaker is all about. You ready? Peacemakers does not equal making nice with pigs and dogs and fools and reprobates. That's not what Jesus is talking about. It means speaking the truth in love. It means actively protecting. Because if it means making nice, then there aren't any pigs and dogs. But Jesus said, do not cast your pearls before, do not give or cast your pearls before pigs. Don't give pigs and dogs the best stuff, meaning your time, effort, energy, and resources. What it means is this, actively protecting. It also is sending message to those that are off track, those that are doing the wrong thing, that they need to be made right. They need to experience peace with God because you're intervening and you're not blowing the bad guy away right away, but you are confronting them. You're speaking truth. You're salt and light. What it means is once we stand up and are protective and we're speaking truth, which will bring peace, it's going to have the perpetrator back off. But it may not happen because what happens? The perpetrator then turns on us, and then they will begin to direct their attention to us, and they will begin to persecute us. And they will do whatever they can, right? So it's really setting boundaries with those being taken advantage of. That's peacemaking, right? When Jesus in John chapter 12, verses 1-7, Jesus is anointed by a woman, really Mary, and she breaks open. She was probably into prostitution, quite frankly. She has a jar of perfume. She breaks it open. she's anointing Jesus's body ahead of time for burial. Judas gets angry, saying, "Why waste such money?" So I also think that Mary was giving up a certain lifestyle. She was going to do the right thing. So I'm reading into that. And what does Jesus do? So Judas runs his mouth saying, basically, what's she doing? And it could have been, the money could have been given to the poor. Jesus replies in verse 7, "Leave her alone. She did this in preparation for my burial. You'll always have the poor among you." So he's referencing the poor, "but you'll not always have me." Isn't that interesting? He said, "Leave her alone." So being a peacemaker means bravely declaring, and this is literal, this is what the term means, bravely declaring God's terms, which makes someone whole. It's not pacifying pigs. It's not pacifying oppressors, which is even worse than a pig. It is letting them know they need to start doing the right thing, and that will bring peace. It references safety and security, promoting peace by protecting those being harmed, bringing the hurtful person back to their senses by speaking truth, by being salt and light. What will happen then? God will bless you by protecting you when the perpetrators, when the oppressors turn their sights upon you. What is going to happen? They're going to mean ill intent. So oppressors go after two categories. They go after those that are vulnerable, and they go after those that are being protective. When you are in either category, you will begin to wonder, where is God? But the good news is what? That God has not forgotten. The Messiah has not forgotten. He will bring justice, not just in the future, though that is also what he was trying to let the Jews that were listening to him know, that God's timing is not always our timing. Jesus got that message through to John the Baptist, but it didn't mean that he was unmoved by John's pain. And the question for those that are on the receiving end of injustice, and we're going to look at this next time, because the greatest question is, Lord, where are you? Do you see? Do you know? Do you hear? When you are on the receiving end of evil, when you are on the receiving end of injustice, it is easy to conclude that God doesn't care. It is easy to conclude that he has left us. Satan will rush right in and say, "Oh, really? So God's a God of love, huh? Where is he?" Can I trust that God has not forgotten? Can I trust that even when nothing is happening, something is happening? There are a number of examples throughout Scripture of people that had very serious questions. There's one story in the Old Testament that is very parallel to the story of Jesus. It's really an Old Testament version of Jesus, and that is the Old Testament story of Joseph, who had not done anything wrong, but was sold and was left for dead. And it went from bad to worse. What do we learn from the story of Joseph? What do we learn about his response when he encounters those that change the course of his life for worse? We will look at that next time, and it will give you great hope to know that God hasn't forgotten, and he wants you to know that your pain, your tears have never fallen on deaf ears. And we will pick up at this point next time on Journey to Healing.
You've been listening to Journey to Healing, sponsored by SurvivorSupport.net. We trust you've been helped by the information our host, Jon Uhler, has shared. To donate to this ministry, schedule a personal consultation with Jon, or to arrange a professional training for your church or organization with Jon, simply visit our website. On behalf of Survivor Support, we look forward to hearing from you and to have you join us next time on Journey to Healing.